Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thanks for joining me, whether you're joining me live or you're watching the recording later on. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. We're talking about CSS transitions and animation today. I think this is a little bit simpler, even though it's going to come off as a little more complex, right? Just because kind of what we're doing, just with animations in general, is a little more complex. I'm just going to spend a lot more time in code today doing demonstrations than I am going to be discussing theory today. So hopefully we can get a lot out of all of that as we kind of progress through what we're going to be talking about today. But when we're talking about animations and we're talking about transitions, we're talking about taking things and we're talking about making them move. And this is, a great benefit for us as we're trying to, call attention to things, as we're trying to make things, become more interactive, build better user interfaces, make things more interesting. I'm going to do some general examples, and then I'm going to move into a more complicated example, I'm not even going to call it a more complicated example. I'm just going to say a more complex example as I build a loading screen. Right, so we're going to just do some basic examples on a screen with some basic items, and then we will we'll work on a loading screen, which should be interesting. So we're talking about CSS transitions and animation. And we're going to start off by talking about the basics. And the basics are basically that, we need kind of two things to apply. We need to apply on the element that is going to be transformed. We're going to put the amount of time we want it to take for this transition to occur. So like in the example that we have here, we want it to take 1 second. And in the state wherein it is transitioned, we want it to have the transform property with what we want to transition. And I want to give you all a list here. I don't have it on a slide, but I will pull over the website of the W3 schools here to show you all sorts of different things here that we can do with our transform properties. You can see that we can use matrices, which are, a very advanced sort of motion, right? When we think about a matrix in programming, we're thinking about basically moving things along a 2D or 3D sort of maze or path, right? We can talk about translation, which is going to be moving things in a singular direction. We can translate an item in a 2-dimensional space or a 3-dimensional space. In the X, Y, or the Z direction, we can scale an item, which means we can make it bigger. We can scale it in the X, Y, or Z direction. We can scale it in a 3D space. Rotate an item, rotate it in the X, Y, or Z, and skew an item. Skew it in the X, Y, or Z. Lots of stuff that can be done here with these. And one of the, a lot of the interesting things that we can see here, we can see some examples here. We'll just check out a demo here really quickly where we can see what the code looks like. Right, we see this skewed and transformed div here, we can see all this live text is still live. It's just really wild. And we can see that it's all transformed on the blue div property here. Now, one of the things that hasn't been done here is the animation, right? We haven't added the animation that we're kind of talking about when we're talking about, let me go full screen here so you all can see this just a little bit better. We haven't added the bit of animation that would allow me to transition from its normal state to this state. Although in order to transform from its normal state to this state, I need something, right? I need some sort of thing to happen that would allow me to make this transformation happen. That case would be the pseudo classes and the things that we were talking about last week when we were talking about our advanced selectors. So that's why we start out talking about our advanced selectors and then move in to this here. So when we talk about our dot element here or whatever we're talking about here, we're talking about our base element, our element our element untransformed. And then when we hover over our element or we use some sort of external factor to manipulate our element, which we will have a look at through our demonstrations, we can make some changes that will allow us to transform our elements. And so it's in those properties that we are able to sort of take that on and do that. And so it's important for us to understand that where we place this transition property is important, because if we want to kind of transition on hover and then back, we can add the animation to the element without the hover pseudo class, so that when we, because one of the things that we've talked about previously in other courses as well, is that a hover action is actually two separate actions, right? A hover action is a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So if we make sure that we have that transition property inside of the base element, the untransformed element, then it will transition both on enter and on leave. So let's have a look at our transition site here for today. All I've done so far is just put in a little bit of HTML so far. Right, we've got a CSS file here. We haven't put in any CSS into it yet. I want to take my notes and make sure I adjust them here. I do have some notes that I'll be referencing here as we're kind of working through today. And so one of the things that I might want to do here as we work with this, you see I have some items that I'm going to make some circles, right? And I'll zoom in here. I'm calling them circles, right? I have circle, circle 2, circle 3. I have some buttons here that I'm calling click, which is kind of interesting, right? That we can use buttons with this process. We'll see how we can do that. Or how we can work with something like that a little bit later on. But we're going to work with just some basic actions here on this circle. We're going to do something a little bit different here with circle 2. That is in conjunction with these different script, which I think is pretty interesting. And then circle 3, we're going to do something entirely different with that as well. So what I want to start out by doing here is I want to go into my CSS, and I want to focus my first circle, which is just the ID of circle, CIR, CLE. And I'm going to give it a width of 150 pixels. We're just going to keep it at pixel width just to keep things simple for the time being. I very well could make this, and you know what, I will. Let's make this a responsive width here. Let's make it, say, 10 Vmax for all intents and purposes. And then to make sure that it is a circle, we could use our aspect ratio of 1:1. Right, so actually, that wasn't actually something that we could do before. Aspect ratio would be use a responsive unit here, but since we can actually use an aspect ratio and have this as 1:1, this will actually work. And if we can use a border radius of 50%, that will change this into a circle. So all that leaves us to do is give this a background color so we can actually see it. So background color. And since it is October the 3rd, first week of October, let's go with a little bit of a darker sort of Halloween orange. Let's go for something like a, I don't know, maybe something like a A9 6400. That's almost a brown. Let's lighten that up just a little bit. Let's see. I think I want that top that number there to go a little bit higher, and that number there to go a lot higher, like to a C8. There we go. That's more like what I want. And so that should give me a nice circle on my site. There it is. All right, so I got a nice circle here, and I want to be able to able to move this. So I'm going to have multiple properties that I'm going to want to move here. But we're going to start off with just one. Right? So I'm going to add transition here. And you know what? There's not a lot of contrast there. Let me just change this color theme really quickly. Ooh, I like that one. Let's use this one today. I actually like this one a lot. So when I go to work a transition, what I want to put in is I want to put the item that I'm going to transition here, which in this case is going to be what it's going to be in my hover. Right, so it's going to be the transform. And I want to put the amount of time that I want it to take to transform. So in this case, we'll say 2 seconds, 2s. Right, so now I can go ahead and I can make my circle hover. So that's hashtag circle, :hover for the pseudo class. And I can add my transform CSS property. This will be we'll do a scale here for this one. And we will make it 200%. So when we hover over this circle over the course of 2 seconds, the transform property in the hover will scale to 200%. When we go off of the hover, it will scale back down over the course of 2 seconds, back to 100%. So we should be able to see that happen. So let's check it out. Pop over here, hover over. We see it scale, we see it get real big. It is, and we hover back and we release, and it goes back down, and we see that sort of animation. Right, we hover over, it gets really big, takes up a lot of real estate. We go back down. And it gets small again. Right, well, we do have a bit of an issue here. Right, and that's that it, you know, it's covering up everything else. So let's move it over, right? Let's move it. Let's move it to the right some. So I'm going to add in my transform here, no comma, I'm just going to add a translate. And we're going to move it on the x-axis and the y-axis. That's the two values that we're going to put in here. So I want to move it, let's say, $30 Vmax on the x-axis. I think it might. I think it might utilize Vmax. It might not. We might have to change it to pixels. We'll go back and do that if we need to. 0 pixels on the y-axis. Now this is all still part of our transform property here. Right, and I am kind of going off book a little bit here, right? This is actually not in my notes. I need to go back. I want to go back and add a border that I'm going to change as well, but we're going to do that too. Right, so I've got this transform here. So now I want to not only make it bigger, I also want to make it move. Right, so we're going to make this so we can see it's bigger and it moves. Now the problem here is that it's moving over. Now I can kind of take my mouse, and if I can time it right, I can follow it. But the problem is that, you know, if I don't time it right, my mouse is off of it. Ooh. That's kind of cool, right? Like, you know, we can see these things moving here, and I've done nothing but write just a little bit of CSS in order to do this. And we can see that it's... Now, we don't need this transition here. I should call that out. Right? But if we don't have that transition there, then it just does the transformation automatically. Right? So if we were to comment that transition out momentarily, then we just see it immediately jumps, and it jumps back. Right, which that's not very attractive. Right, that doesn't look real great on our website. So let's bring that back. Let's not make it move quite so much. Let's try just 3 Vmax. See if that maybe makes it to where I don't have to follow it as much. Yeah, I think that'll work. Let's see, maybe we can do like 5 Vmax. Just so you all can see that it's actually moving a little bit more. Yeah, I think that works for me. And just for the sake of seeing it scaled, let's see it scaled. All right, so let's scale it down. We'll make it taller. And we'll watch it there. Right, not perfect, right? But pretty good. Like, ideally, we would do some more with this to kind of keep this in the screen. We might add some margin to it. We can manipulate other elements besides just our transform property here as well, right? Like if we wanted to add, say, a border to this. So I'm going to go up above my background color here. Let's go, let's go for a nice green border to kind of stick with the nice little Halloween color scheme here. So a border will go 3 pixels, solid, and a nice dark green, right? So let's go for like a hashtag 32 99 00. Let's go even darker. Let's go for like 55 maybe. Yeah, I like that. Let's see what that looks like. That's a nice little thin border there. We can kind of see it scale up there. Because when it's scaling my div, or when it's scaling my object here, it's scaling everything all at once, right? So it's basically just taking it all and just stretching it like it's taffy. So when it's scaling my border, it's scaling my border similarly. But I can also transition my border as well. So what I want to do is I want to add another rule for my border down here in my hover as well, right? So if I can take my border, I can jump it up to some big number here, right? Like let's say 25 pixels. And maybe I want it to transition even slower. Maybe I even want it to change colors. Right? Let's make it change colors. So let's say it's 25 pixels, solid, and let's say it's purple now. So let's say it's going to be let's see, purple is going to be about twice blue than red. So let's go for something like a hashtag 5500, extra hashtag in there. A9, something like that. Right, and we can actually add more transitions here by just separating them with a comma. So now I can add a comma here, and I can transition my border for, let's say, 4 seconds. Right, so all the things that I'm changing in my hover, just like we learned about in the last module with our hover pseudo selector. We're adding in this idea of our transform, which is giving us the ability to kind of make things bigger and smaller and move them around without having to adjust our width and height and all that kind of stuff. And we're also seeing how we can kind of take and change our transitions here and make those different as well. So if we look at our site now, we can see that not only is the size changing, not only is it moving, but we can watch that border expand. And if you pay close enough attention, right, you can watch the color change, right? Like it kind of goes gray for a bit there in the middle. Maybe if it was a lighter green earlier on, right? If we made this a bit of a lighter green like I had it initially, it might be a little bit easier to see. Like if we started that out there, maybe it might be a little more obvious for you all. So let's try that. Like as it's making its transition, you can see that it starts nice and green at the start. Might even make more sense if I made the border just a little bit bigger to start out, like maybe a 6 before it transitions. So now we can see the green border here, and then as it gets bigger, we can see it changes color, it gets bigger, it grows in shape and size and changes color. Right? We're making these changes and we're making these differences, right? And then once our mouse goes away, we can see it collapse and go back to normal. Which is really, really wild. But, one of the things that we noticed was that hover is not our only pseudo selector, is it? Focus is also a pseudo selector. And so we can also use focus on these buttons to take advantage of being able to use these buttons without having to do any JavaScript or anything, with just via CSS, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's give that a try. I've got a circle number 2 on here. You can't see it yet, but you will be able to. So let's focus our hashtag circle 2 here. And let's just start it out with a width of 10 Vmax, the way we were doing before. Aspect ratio 1:1. Border radius is going to be 50%. And let's make it our green color we used at the top instead of some different color this time. So let's give it a background color of that green color. Nice. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take and we're going to move it. Right? We're going to use our we're going to translate it here based on when we click one of these buttons. And one of those buttons gets focus. Now we're going to add our transition here. So it's going to be transition. We're going to transition on the transform. And let's do 2 seconds again, right? 2 seconds. So now, if we look here at our CSS, we notice we have this circle here. We can get rid of this text. We don't have to have this text. We're in our HTML here. We can look at our circle. And we can look at our buttons. We can see that both of our buttons precede our circle. So we can take one of these buttons, like our click button, which is hashtag click, And we are going to use the focus pseudo selector on that. And one of the things that we talked about last week is our subsequent sibling selector. Right? Meaning that as long as this thing comes after, then we can tell that it's there. Of our hashtag circle 2. Right? So when our click button is focused, the subsequent sibling, circle 2, we want to basically do our transform, translate, we'll do 10 Vmax on the X and 0 pixels on the Y. And we will save. So now we can click and we can watch it move over. Right? We used absolutely 0 CSS. Absolutely 0. We just got focus on it. And then when we take the focus off of it, it goes back. Put the focus on it. It goes over. Click anywhere else to take the focus off of it. And it moves back. Which is pretty cool, right? We can use this button without any JavaScript to move this on the page. We can also change its color, right? Like we also have this hashtag click 2 button that we have. We can do the same thing. We can focus. We can use our tilde selector. We can do it on the same circle, on circle 2. Right? We're just using a different button to take our focus now. Our second button. And this time we're going to say background color. Let's just make it like a... let's make it something really different, right? Like, let's make it like a dark red. Let's make it like a maroon. So we can add that to our background dash color. 2 seconds. We can add that to our transition as well here. Save that. So now if we click our first button, it moves over. We click off of that first button. It comes back. We click our second button. Is that what I called the second button? Oh, I called it click 2. Oh, I didn't prepare this one, so... Oh, I see what I did. Circle 2 and not circle. That's why that's not working. So let's go back here now. That's better. And then we click off and it goes back to green. So I click there, turns red, click off, goes back to green, click there. And I can even kind of do a little bit of a combo. Although when I click the second button, it takes the focus off the first one. Right, which is pretty cool, right? A lot of interesting stuff there that we can do with that. Now I've got one more circle in this demonstration, right? We got a circle 3. In our HTML here. So this is going to be the last thing I want to do in this basic demonstration. And then I'm going to want to move over to our loading animation demonstration. To do a little bit of some more things there with that. But for this, I want to switch briefly back over to our presentation. Whoops, forgot to turn off my countdown there. Because for this, we're going to need to use keyframe animation and easing. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a predefined animation that we're going to define. We're going to call it wiggle. Using keyframes that we're going to define at different ways, different times during the animation. And then we're going to add some easing to our animation to be able to add a nicer curve, right? Like if we look at the way that gravity kind of impacts something, it's not just a constant specific time, right? Like if you look at something fall, as something falls, it gains momentum while it's falling. So it starts falling and gets faster as it falls toward the ground, right? So it's not just a constant speed all the time. And then as something hits the ground and bounces back up, right, that momentum is stored as potential energy for a brief period of time, and then released back out as kinetic energy. So it starts back out, going back out really fast, and then as it loses that momentum, it gets slower again. Right, so we use this easing to add prettier transitions or a speed curve like that. And so the most common one is that one that, we kind of talked about there, which is ease. A slow start, a fast middle, a slow end. Linear also happens, right? It specifies a transition effect that's the same speed from the start to end, which doesn't happen much. Ease in specifies a transition with a slow start. Ease out specifies a transition effect with a slower end. Ease in and out specifies a transition effect with a slow start and end that kind of speeds up in the middle. And then our cubic Bezier, which allows us to kind of determine our own values, which makes things a bit complicated. But this allows us, to apply animation using the animation property and keyframes. So the different keyframes denote different positions for an element in our animation, and so we always define our keyframes first before adding animation to an element. So the first thing that we will want to do in our CSS is define our keyframes. And so in this instance, we shall look at our keyframes. And in CSS, we do our keyframes, starting out with the @ symbol, and then the term keyframes, all one word. And our identifier here, VS Code filled out for us. We're going to call it wiggle. Our keyframes is going to be called wiggle here. This is going to be our wiggle animation. And at each place in our animation, we're going to define different key elements for the animation to happen. Right, so at 0% of our animation, which is the very start of our animation, we're going to define the following things. We're going to want left 0, top 0, background color. Let's use maroon. And that's what our element is going to look. Those are the rules for our element at the 0%, at just the start of our animation. So let's say halfway through our animation, at the 50% point. Right? Now this is just CSS again, right? Let's say we're going to move to the left. Maybe 250 pixels. Just wiggle it over a little bit. Maybe we're going to move down from the top. 200 pixels. Maybe we're going to change that background color. Maybe let's make it that green that we've been using. Let's make it this green. Just so we have the biggest color difference. And that's it midway through. That's it the middle of our timeline of our animation. And at the end of our animation, at the end of our timeline of our animation, at 100%, maybe we want to go back. Right? So maybe I want to just kind of copy what we had for frame 0 here. But you know what? Just to make it a little more interesting, let's change that color. And we'll throw on another closing curly brace at the end to match the very first one. And so now what we've done here is we've basically created a timeline. Oh, I already had that. Whoops. It was just on a different line. Well, we can just delete that. I've created a timeline of frames that are my keyframes that are going to define my animation. And so it'll just kind of ease between these based on how I determine it when I write my CSS rules here. So I will write my CSS rules for hashtag circle 3. So since we are using left and top here, we need to set a position on this. So we'll set position relative. We'll make it a width of the same thing we've used for everything else, which is 10v max. Aspect ratio 1:1. Border radius 50%. Background color. We'll start with the same color that we're starting in our frame 0, which is going to be our maroon. And now we're going to add our animation, which is going to be wiggle, what we named our animation. This whole animation is going to loop over the course of 5 seconds. We are going to ease it. And we are going to run it infinitely. So now, once we have that, we can look at it here and we can just see it do its thing, right? It's just going to sit there and go back and forth and move back and forth and change its color. And you can kind of see how it's starting a little bit faster and tapering off. If we changed this to be You know, instead of ease, maybe ease in. Instead of just ease. We could see the way that kind of changes it, way it kind of starts slow and picks up momentum toward the end. Right, so these are just some basic examples of what we can do with this, right? Just some really simple examples. We've got a hover example. We've got a couple focus examples. And we've got an animation example that takes place in perpetuity. Now, let's switch over to our loading animation. I got us a loading animation here. We'll close these. We'll open these. And actually, before I do this, let me just go up here and let me open up my terminal. Since we kind of completed that, let me just run some git here, right? All right. So now we can work on our loader. And we see in our loader we have a main class of container, we have a section class of loader, we have 3 circles, and a caption of "we're almost there." And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of code. And you can kind of follow along if you want. My recommendation is to watch the recording of this. Looks like everybody's is choosing to watch the recording of this today anyway. Just pause as we're getting to certain places. But we're going to start out with just some code on the body here. I'm going to set the body to display as flex. That way I can do some vertical centering. Just doing some setting either a main container or the body container to display as flex. And then using some of the element items that we can use with our flex documents, that it gives us those options to use, really helps us out with that vertical centering. I'm going to set a height of 100 viewport height, just to make sure that the height of my body is the height of my viewport. Background color is going to be HSL 200, 100%, 30%. Just a real nice blue. Just because sometimes you need a real nice blue. And overflow is going to be hidden. Right, so if we look at this site as it stands now, we just got a nice blue. Right, just because sometimes you need a nice blue. I like this color blue. It's a real nice blue. It's kind of close to one of the CCC blues. Not quite, but yeah, it's close. Some other things that we might want to do here. We might want to take our asterisk selector and do some box sizing, border, box, that sort of thing. Right, maybe font, family, sans serif, color white, just to go ahead and take care of that right now. Now we've got a container in here as well. If we look at our index, we have a container. That's our main item here. So we have that set up here as a class. So in our CSS here, that's going to be dot container. I'm going to display it as flex as well. I'm going to give it a max width of max content. Then I'm going to give it a flex direction of column. And margin auto margins all the way around. So this is so our body is a flex container, our container is a flex container. So I want this to be flexing on this, to be flexing on what's inside of it. Right, that way this centers up this, which can center up that, and everything can be, you know, all well and good, right? The loader element is another wrapper element. If we look at our index here, we have a section here that's for our loader element. It's just wrapping our circles. So that's going to be dot loader. And I'm actually just going to give this some static widths. Right? I don't even care if this... I mean, this is going to be relatively small, so I really don't care if this is responsive or not, right? It's going to fit on basically any screen. It's just going to kind of be nestled in the center of any device it's going to be on, so it's fine. Width is going to be 240 pixels. Height is going to be 100 pixels. Margin is going to be auto. And we're going to display. I think I can I inherit? I'm going to inherit because I want it to be display flex also. Then finally we're going to deal with our circle, right? So that's dot circle. So for our circle is going to be a width of 50 pixels, an aspect ratio of 1:1, a background of one of my favorite grays, hashtag CCC, border radius of 50%, margin of 15 pixels, right? This one we just kind of have to trust because I've already done the math on this one. And this is going to get an animation. So we're going to come back to these to do an animation. But this is going to be to show you how easy a loading screen is. So if we look at this now, we see, okay, we're getting pretty close here. And can I use... I might not be able to use aspect ratio here. I might have to use height 50 pixels here. Since this is flex box, yes. Right, so now we can see everything's just like nice and nestled just right here in the center. If we had it on a small screen, it would just be nice and nestled in the center of whatever screen that you're on, right? So that's the way this is responsive. We're going to address our text here. Right, so far, no animations, right? So we're just going to address our text, our caption. So that's going to be dot caption. Margin is going to be auto to center it up. Font size is going to be 2 rem. Everything else we've already taken care of. So this is what we're dealing with right now with our loading screen. What we're going to want to do here, now that we have this set up, is we're going to want to make these balls jump up and down. Right? You've seen those loading screens where we kind of create this wave effect of these balls jumping up and down, where when one's up here, one's down here, and one's up here, and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to create the keyframes here to make this jump. So we're going to create an at keyframes. And we're going to call it jump. So at 0%, our first frame, all we're going to do is adjust the margin. So we're just going to move it along the margin. So when it's at the bottom, it'll be at 0 margin. When it's at the top, we're actually going to take it up in a negative margin. So we're going to start at the bottom, and we'll say margin dash top 0 at around 35%, around a third of the way through the animation. Margin top will become negative 75%, which will shoot it up. And then once we get to around 70%, around 2/3 of the way through the animation, right? So we'll have another one to where it'll come back, you know, and it'll kind of do its thing and kind of wait and do its thing. So this will take it back down to margin dash top 0. And that's almost it. Right, so I'm going to find my circle here. We're just going to add our animation to it. So here on our circle, we're going to add animation. We're going to put the animation that we're going to add, which is jump. We're going to add the amount of time that we want to take for this animation to occur, which is 2 seconds. We're going to add our easing information, which is going to be ease dash in dash out. And then we are going to want it to loop infinitely. So now if we save that, look at our site now. We see all of our bubbles bouncing together, right? Goes to 0 top margin, up to negative 75 top margin, back down to 0, and it kind of pauses and waits a second before it goes back up. But we said we wanted this kind of wave effect, right? They're not doing this wave effect. Well, let me tell you about one more property we have that we can use. In our index.html, you'll see that I have an IDB and an IDC. There is such a thing called an animation delay. So if I delay the animation, let's say maybe I delay the animation. If we did the math here, right? In fact, I'm actually going to do the math since we're doing. I tell you what, let's do it over 3 seconds to make it easier. Let's delay this animation on hashtag B. Let's delay. Let's animation delay. We'll say 1 second. And on hashtag C, let's animation dash delay 2 seconds. So now we'll see. I mean, that's a little bit too far off, right? So maybe we want to kind of play with that a little bit. What I have in my pre-done one here is on 2 seconds, doing it at 0.4 seconds and 0.8 seconds, right? And you can just kind of adjust your numbers and get what you like the best. And that leaves you with this. And so that's our loading screen using an animation. So that's all that I have for you today. We'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody who is here with me live has any questions. But we'll turn on the music for just a couple minutes. And that's where we'll end for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.